Hello, my name is Andi Siti Shafira Salsabila. Today I will give a presentation about an author of English literature, Samuel Richardson. Samuel Richardson was one of the most well-known and important 18th century writers of his three monumental novels, Pamela, Clarissa, and Sir Charles Grandison. Richardson is widely recognized as the inventor of the epistolary novel, that is, novels written as a collection of letters and other communication between the protagonists. All three of his novels use the epistolary form. Richardson's style and fairly stoic and moral tone were characteristic of 18th century fictions. He is arguably the most influential novelist of his generation, with literally hundreds of writers imitating his writings. Due to his outdated tone and the length of his novel, Richardson isn't as good with the modern audience as some of his contemporaries. His work is still loved by many readers, and critics will point out that his mastery of 18th century English prose is almost invisible, but Richardson is still a product of his time. His long and often doctrine works are not timeless for novelists like Sterne and Defoe. Still, Richardson is one of the most important writers of his time. His influence on subsequent novelists such as Jane Austen was immeasurable, and fiction writers of the 18th and early 19th centuries could not escape Richardson's long shadow. Richardson was born in Makeworth, Derbyshire in 1689. His mother, Elizabeth, was a not a gentlewoman. Her father was a sailor merchant, and his son described it as gravity and serious. Indeed, from an early age, Richardson was serious and demanding man he wrote in his novel. Richardson had a little formal education, and at the age of 17, in 1706, Richardson was forced to begin a 7-year apprenticeship with John Wilde and a year of printing training. In 1715, he was an honorary citizen of Stationers' Company, a citizen of London, and 6 to 7 years after his apprenticeship, he set up his own printer business and eventually settled in Salisbury Court. In 1721, Richardson married Martha Wilde, the daughter of his former employer. His wife died on 23 January 1731 after the death of 5 of her 6 children. The last child survived only 2 years from his mother. Richardson remarried in 1733 after the child's death. His second wife, Elizabeth, was also the daughter of former employer John Lake. Together they had 6 children, 2 of whom died in early childhood. 4 of her daughters reached adulthood and lived longer than her father. Richardson's private life has always been described by literary critics as particularly demanding. Few writers have seen as many deaths and personal sufferings as Richardson. This experience undoubtedly influenced the somewhat gloomy tone of his later writings. In 1733, Richardson wrote The Apprentice Fate Macum, where he encouraged young men to be diligent and self-denial. This text was written in response to the epidemic evils of the present age, and is best known for condemning popular entertainment such as theaters, taverns, and gambling. The manual aims at apprenticeships as the focus of social moral improvement, not because he is more sensitive to malicious intent, but because, as Richardson suggests, he is more sensitive to moral improvement than his social betters. Richardson's early writing had only moderate success, but Richardson's business insights were surprisingly enthusiastic, and by the 1730s, he was soon the best in the publishing industry. Richardson joined the Stationers' Company, a guild for all British people in the book trade, and soon became director of the Stationers' Company. He became known as one of the best printers across London, and as his fortune grew, he began to climb the ladder of society. He bought a country house and entertained intellectuals and friends, including Samuel Johnson, actor Collie Sieber, and even Speaker of the House Arthur Onslow. It was in the last few years that Richardson humbly began writing fictional letters. Sometimes in the 1730s, he was asked to write a series of fictitious letters. This format was relatively popular among serial publications of the time. This collection has become known as a family letter about important occasions. During this time, it is clear that he began to imagine the possibility of writing a novel in the form of a series of letters, as Richardson wrote in his notebook. Based on true stories heard elsewhere, Richardson began writing his novel Pamela in the winter of 1739. It was published a year after Richardson was 50 years old. The next is author's works. The first one is Pamela or Virtue Rewarded. Samuel Richardson began work on Pamela on November 10, 1739 and completed it on January 1740. Pamela's popularity is largely due to its effective technique of revealing stories through letters from the main character. This was associated with the moral nature of the story and became accepted by the fast-growing middle class of the country. So the book created a sensation of journalism. The epistolary form was an innovation that Richardson was very proud of. Therefore, Pamela helped reinvent the literary genre in a way that helped teach readers virtues. Still, many modern readers were shocked by the more graphic scenes and some suspicious behavior of the characters. For example, it was easy to see Pamela as a young woman who plots to gain a higher society status by marrying a lady. Henry Fielding has proved Pamela twice. One is Samela Anonymous in the form of the same letter, and another with Pamela's brother Joseph and Joseph Andrews, who tells the story of his efforts to protect his virtues. The next is Clarissa, or The History of Young Lady. Clarissa is an epistolary novel written by Samuel Richardson into 4 parts and published in 1747 to 1748. Clarissa was generally the most widely respected by critics. In it, Richardson used a very effective letter form to create a psychological compelling character that simultaneously ponders some of the most important moral questions of the 18th century. It is one of the greatest novels of the 18th century and is widely recognized as a landmark in English literature. The novel was a big hit. People got hooked on it and asked Richardson not to let Clarissa die, and like Pamela, to live happily forever. However, what impressed the audience most was the demonic image of love racing. According to some estimates, love races are brighter than Clarissa as a character. According to some critics, readers accepted by psychology and voluminous character of the novel differently than the author expected. In addition, psychology is brought to the fore, blocking important moral aspects for Richardson. Richardson realized that his novel was incomprehensible and readers misunderstood the character of lovers. He provided part 3 with an extensive commentary that explains exactly how to read his novels and how to understand all the heroic acts. Clarissa is a masterpiece of psychological poetry. Moral obligation to Clarissa face opposite to the principal's love race. Clarissa was good and moral, and Lovelace were cynical and selfish. She was a victim, he was a predator. They are the opposite concept of man. The last one is The History of Sir Charles Grandison. Samuel Richardson wrote The History of Sir Charles Grandison in 7 volumes and was published in 1754. This was the last novel he completed. The history of Sir Charles Grandison, commonly referred to as Sir Charles Grandison is a letter novel by the English writer Samuel Richardson, first published on February 1753. This book was a response to Henry Fielding's History of Tom Jones, Foundling, which set moral standards for Richardson's early novels. The novel follows the story of Harriet Byron, followed by Sir Hargrave, released only when her Sir Charles Grandison comes to her help. The novel contains similar writing formats as previous novels by Richardson, Clarissa, and Pamela. In contrast to these novels, the main male character, Charles Grandison, is morally good man, and like the malice revealed by Lafresse, motivated to choose such a male character for the inspiration of his wife to make friends who want something that corresponds to the moral of Richardson female characters. Okay, next I'm going to talk about the selected work, I Choose Pamela or Virtue Rewarded. So here is plot summary of Pamela. Pamela Andrews is a 15-year-old maid who lives in the estate of Bedfordshire. When her employer Lady B dies, her son Mr. B becomes interested in an innocent girl and quickly turns into her direct attempt to seduce her from her generosity. Pamela refuses to move forward, so she is thinking of going home with her parents to live in poverty. But when he got on the wind of her plans, Mr. B accused Pamela of having an affair with her, notified her parents, and prevented them from going anywhere. The devastated girl gets a job at Lincolnshire Estate, where her employer's wife is. Pamela suffers from frequent beatings and long-term imprisonment and is in secret contact with Ralph Williams. Desperate to escape, Pamela decides to stick to her morals and resist new advances by Mr. B, who continues his jealous pursuit. At the end of the novel, Pamela is forced to face fear of moral violation, and Mr. B faces the possibility of reforming his tolerant method. This novel set in the English countryside in the 1730s. Another setting in this novel is Bedfordshire Estate. Pamela works at Bedfordshire Estate for Mr. B mother when the woman died. Mr. B first tries Pamela in Bedfordshire's estate just to kidnap her and before allowing her to go. After the wedding, Pamela and Mr. B return to Bedfordshire. And another setting is Lincolnshire Estate. Mr. B imprisons Pamela in his Lincolnshire real estate to achieve his goal of undermining her virtues. Miss Jukes helped Mr. B by looking at Pamela and preventing Pamela from escaping. Eventually, Mr. B visits Pamela in Lincolnshire Estate and is impressed by her extreme virtues and marries her. In Samuel Richardson, Pamela or Virtue Rewarded, one of the comprehensive themes was the change and development of the social class and how they influenced the main character, Pamela, and other characters. In the 18th century, the notion of social status and wealth in European culture prioritized certain genders and treated the opposite as inferior. This social normality created a domino effect, leading to a constant battle between what was right and what was right for the position. Throughout the book, Samuel Richardson points out that men should choose their wives for virtue, not for money or social status. Okay, next I'm going to talk about characters and characterization of this novel. The first character is Pamela, a 17-year-old, energetic, cute, and courageous maid exposed to her new Mr. Big's sexual progress after the death of her mother, Lady B. She is the devout daughter of her poor parents, Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, and she writes a huge number of letters encouraging her to keep her innocent at all costs. Pamela resists Mr. B for a long week of his attack on her and does not succumb to his subsequent tenderness in his attack. It will take some time to admit it, but Pamela is attracted to Mr. B from the beginning and gradually begins to love him. They got married in the middle of her novel, and then Pamela's her loveliness and calm help her secure the goodwill of her new husband's highborn friend. Next, Mr. B, a 25 or 26 years old who owned a real estate in Bedfordshire, Lincolnshire, Kent, London. He is Pamela's employer, persecutor, and future husband. Richardson considered Mr. B names to protect his non-fiction excuse, but scholars suggest from the manuscript that the novelist has Brandon in mind. Mr. B tended to be bold and tried to get Pamela to return his sexual attention to the point of imprisonment in his Lincolnshire estate. However, his basic dignity prevents him from carrying out an attack on her, and under her influence, he reforms himself in the middle of the novel. The next is Lady B, Pamela's first employer. Mr. B and the mother of Miss Devers, Lady B, was morally sincere and kind to Pamela, raised her and contributed to the formation of her noble personality. On her deathbed, she told her son to take care of all Bedfordshire servants, especially Pamela. Mrs. Jukes, Mr. B, Lincolnshire real estate housekeeper, and Pamela's impersonate chief criticker. Pamela portrays her as her serious villain, psychically unpleasant and sexual ambiguous, but her depraved hyperbolic attribution is her guilt for Mr. B, whose emotions are quite inconsistent. It might be Pamela's way to distract. Mrs. Jukes is devout to her master, but has one drawback. She is not excluded from helping Pamela's attempt rape, but is willing to do an injustice in his service. Next is Mrs. Jervis, an elderly housekeeper in Bedfordshire estate of Mr. B, one of noble servants who applies to Mrs. Devers on behalf of Pamela. She has a sophisticated background and is a talented manager who is believed to be the cornerstone of an orderly Bedfordshire home. However, despite her friendliness and her mother's interness on Pamela, she is of little help in protecting her young friend from the greedy progress of her master. Next, Mr. Williams, Mr. B. Jr., minister in Lincolnshire. Pamela asks for his help to escape her prisoner and finds him loyal but ineffective. He failed in trying to become Pamela's husband, and when Mr. B sent him to debtor's prison, his effort against her eventually failed. Overall, he is credited but unattractive and suffers from a position as a warship who no one takes seriously. Mr. B's long-term occupation with her rival Williams only helped to monitor his danger. Next, John Andrews, Pamela's father and her chief correspondent. He is noble and educated like his daughter, who was once a school teacher, but his fortune has now declined and is now a farm worker. He had 2 sons. They were dead now and made him poor before they died. Pamela admits to her parents that she has shaped her character by raising her to virtue and setting an example of her honest and enjoyable poverty. Next, Lady Devers, Squire Bedfordshire's servant, relies on Pamela's help for Mr. B's married sister. She violently protested her brother's union with her mother's maid and exposed Pamela to a miserable afternoon of abuse and bullying, but eventually recognized and thanked her new sister-in-law. She once cleaned up after her brother had an affair with Sally Godfrey. Lady Devers is exposed to dramatic mood swings that alternate between fleshy and mean humor, but is basically as decent as her brother. So that's all my presentation. The conclusion is Samuel Richardson took part in the evolution of English literature in modern era. He was the most notable writer. Through his works, he introduced the epistolary method, which was depicts a narrative story through letters by one or more characters. Regarding his life, he was unfortunate as he was born from impoverished family. Furthermore, he lost his children in the first marriage and remarried. In the first appearance of his writing, he only achieved a moderate success. Then he started to write fictional letters several years after the period business. He wrote three prominent works entitled Pamela or Virtue Rewarded, Clarissa or The History of Young Lady, and The History of Sir Charles Grandison. Okay, that's all for me. Thank you very much for your attention, and Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.